Let's talk about one of the most powerful and versatile selectors in CSS, and that is the has selector. A lot of people call it the parent selector, but it's capable of a lot more than just selecting the parent. For example, with it, you can do cool stuff like this in CSS without using any JavaScript. Now, if you're not familiar with the has selector, don't worry, we'll cover everything you need to know in this course. But hey, if we're just meeting, my name is Adi. I'm a web designer and developer. And in this course, we'll first have a look at the has selector syntax and explore some basic techniques. And then we'll create some practical examples. By the end of it, you'll have a solid understanding of what the has selector is and how you can effectively use it in your CSS code. But before we get into all that, I want to quickly tell you about an amazing resource called Envato Elements. Here you can find tons of useful resources like fonts, icons, UI kits, WordPress themes, music, stock photos, and much more. For creatives like me, this is an awesome resource because all the assets have simple commercial licensing and you're not bound to any contract. Therefore, you can cancel whenever you want. So if you're interested, check out the link in the video description. All right, so let's get started by looking at the syntax of the selector and understanding how it works. Before we get started, you should know that the video description contains links to all the resources that I used in this video, as well as links to all the source files. So if you want to follow along, you can download those files from there. Also, don't forget to subscribe to Envato Tuts Plus for more free content just like this. All right, so what is the has selector? Well, according to the official spec, the definition looks something like this. That's pretty technical, isn't it? Let's try that again. First of all, has is a pseudo-class, and a pseudo-class is a keyword that you add to a selector, which selects an element based on a certain state or context. For example, when using the hover pseudo-class, we're essentially selecting the hover state of that anchor element. So we can refer to has as a selector. It's not incorrect. In the end, we are selecting something with it. As for the rest of the definition, we can rewrite that into something like this. Has is a CSS pseudo-class that allows you to select an element based on whether or not it contains another element that matches a specified selector. So to put that information to good use, let me show you a couple of examples. Let's start with this. We have two figure elements, each one containing an image. The one on the right also contains a fig caption, right? So if we take a look at the code, we can see that we have the two figures, and we can see the second one contains a fig caption. Now, what I want to do is style this figure, right? So the second one a bit differently because it must also accommodate the fig caption. And this is a perfect use case for the has selector. So what we can do in CSS, we can say something like this: figure has fig caption, and we can set the styles. Let's say I want to change the background color, maybe add a border, maybe add some padding, and round off the corners. So let's look at the results now. We have two figure elements, but the second one, which has a fig caption, is styled differently. And as you can see, the styles that I just wrote, so the background, the border, the padding, the border radius, is only applied to the second figure element, this one, because it contains the fig caption. And this is exactly what the has selector is doing. Remember the definition. Has is a pseudo-class that selects an element based on whether or not it contains another element that matches a specified selector. So in my case, I used this type selector, fig caption, and it matches this element, this second element here. And I did that without using any kind of classes or IDs. So that's the basic way it works. Now, before we move any further, let's talk browser support. Overall, browser support is excellent. Pretty much all the major browsers support the has relational pseudo-class, except Firefox, unfortunately. You can enable it with a flag. It's this flag right here, layout.css.hasSelector.enabled, right? But it's not supported by default. The other ones, Chrome, Edge, Safari, Opera, all support it. IE, of course, this is an old browser, so we don't even consider this. And also some of the mobile browsers do not support this feature, but this is pretty awesome. It will be supported in the near future, so actually there's no reason you should not use this right now. All right, now you might be wondering why a selector like has would be useful. And the short answer is it allows you to write less code. So let me give you an example to show that. So let's actually go to our demo 2 here. Right, so we have the same example as before. And let's say that I want to achieve the same result. I want to style this figure that has a fig caption separately, right? So I would go back to the code. I have the two figures, but in order to differentiate between them, we need to use some classes or IDs. So what we can say is we can say class custom figure, and we're going to add it here as well. And on this second one, I'm going to add an extra class called with caption. So then in CSS, I would say figure, custom figure, and then with caption. All right, so I would then write the same style. I would add my background, my border, the padding, and the border radius. And of course, the result is exactly the same, but this time you need to write more code, right? You need to add separate classes, whereas what we had previously was very simple. In HTML, we just had the figure element, no extra classes, no extra IDs, and we just used the has selector to determine which one of these elements, or to select the element which had the fig caption, and then style that separately. So as you can see, it's a lot more convenient to use a selector like has in these types of situations. Now, so far we checked if the parent element contains a certain child and then style the parent according to that. But we're actually not limited to that behavior. Let's have a look at the following example. We have two cards which are pretty much identical, except the card on the right has an image, right? Now, what I would like to do is I want to have this image span the entire width of the card, and I would like the title that's above the image to not have this border bottom, right? So how do we do that with the has selector? Well, first of all, let's start with the padding, right? So I want to target the card that has an image and set the left and right padding to 0. So we do that by going here. Right? So we have a div class card, and we can say card has img, and I can set padding inline to 0. Padding inline in this writing direction basically means padding left and padding right. So I can save that, refresh. So now only the card that has an image has that side padding removed. That's good. So the image looks right, but the other content doesn't, right? So this title, it doesn't look right. We need some sort of distance between it and the edge. And the same goes for this content, right? It needs that 2 rem of padding to the side. So we can say something like this. We can duplicate this and we can say on the cards that have an image, we can target the h2, right, which is the element that I use as a title, and also the card content, right? So I can copy this, paste it here, card content. And I can say padding inline 2 rem. So now only the title and the actual card content gets that 2 rem padding inline. The image stays the same. Now, what about this, this line here? I need to remove it on the card that has the image. So I can say card. This time we can target the h2. So h2 has plus image. And I can say border bottom 0. So let's see if that works. And it does. So what's up with this, you might ask? Well, it's pretty simple. Plus img is a selector that basically selects an image that follows the h2. Right? So if I say h2 plus img, if I say border 1 pixel solid red, it's going to select the image that's after an h2 or is a sibling of h2, and it's going to add a border. And that's exactly what we're doing here. We can say h2, if it has an image sibling, then we select that h2 and we set the border bottom to 0, and we can also set the padding bottom to 0, just to remove a little bit of that space. All right, so quite simple, actually. In this example, yeah, we have 2 cards, one of them with a standard structure of h2 and card content, the other one h2 image and then card content. And I want to make changes to some of the elements in the cards that have an image, in our case, the second card. So first of all, we remove the padding by using the selector. So if the card has an image, I remove the side padding. Then if the card has an image, I select the h2 and the card content and I set the padding to those elements. And finally, I select all the h2s that have an image sibling and I remove the border and the padding. So as you can see, the has selector is very powerful and very versatile. And hopefully after watching this introduction lesson, you now understand its syntax and what you can use it for. Now, let's dive a little bit deeper and take a look at some more practical examples. Let's start with practical example number 1. We have a typical navigation menu with a couple of items, but the second one has a submenu, right? The code for that looks something like this. We have a nav and inside an unordered list. And then for each link, we have a list item. But then for the submenu, we have another unordered list inside the list item alongside with the anchor tag. Now, what I want to do here is actually add a little arrow right here next to the services text. That's going to indicate, hey, this is a submenu. And that's quite easy to do. I can add a class here, or I can add like a physical HTML element, like an image or an SVG. Or I can add like a pseudo element to this, but of course that would involve using a class or an ID. And I want to keep this as simple as possible. Well, this is a great use case for the has selector because I can target the list item that has a UL inside it and style that accordingly. So here's how I do that. We're going to say nav list item that has an UL, and then I can say a after. So I'm using a pseudo element. And let's actually use the correct syntax there. And I can say content arrow down. Okay. So now if I go back, we have a menu item that says services arrow down. And as you can see, it only applies to this list item because it has a sub menu. It has a UL inside it. But we can also see the arrow down pseudo element being applied to these other anchor tags. So to prevent that, we're only going to target the immediate children, not all of them, right? So now this only gets applied to the parent anchor tag. And of course, we're not going to have the text arrow down. We're going to have an image. And I'm going to use an SVG for that, an encoded SVG to be more precise. So instead of text, I'm going to say URL, and I'm going to paste in this. What I did basically was I had an arrow in a Figma document. I copied it as an SVG, and then I opened a URL encoder, pasted the SVG code there, and it gave me this basically. It's quite simple. And now we have a nice arrow right next to the services text. And of course, this is possible because the anchor tag itself has a display of flex. So we're using flexbox. I set a gap of 0.5 rems, and I aligned the items to the center. Of course, without these, the arrow would be poorly aligned. Not to mention it would break the layout that we had here. So let's just stick to the flexbox code there. So that's example number 1, right? We targeted the list item that had or that has an UL. In our case, it's this one. And then we targeted the after pseudo element for the anchor tag. And then we just added the image. It's really up to you how you add this image here. You can do it in so many different ways. I chose an encoded SVG. Now, let's move on to example number 2. And example number 2 is a form with 2 fields, one for email, one for password. You can think of it as a sign-up form where we enter our email address, a password, and we start a free trial, right? But the thing is, I want to do some validation, right? So I want a valid email address, and I also want a password that's at least 4 characters. And what I did in code was that I set some patterns, right? So in the email field, I set this pattern, which basically checks for a valid email address. And in the password field, I chose, or I used this pattern, which basically checks that the password has at least 4 characters, regardless of what characters those are. Now, when doing this, and when setting the attribute of required in an input field like this, if the value that you input is invalid, then the input itself will receive an invalid state. This type of validation would be quite simple to do with JavaScript. But if we prefer like a CSS only variant, then we can easily do this with the has attribute. So here's how we do that. First of all, I already created field errors, right? As you can see here, below each input, I have a paragraph with the class of field error that says, hey, the email address you entered is not valid, or that the password must contain at least 4 characters. And by default, I'm actually hiding these errors by setting the opacity to 0. And they're positioned absolutely. So Let me actually comment this so you can see where they are. So I'm displaying them absolutely to the side, and they look something like this. And what I want to do is I want to show these whenever the respective field is invalid. So we start the following way. We say field has invalid, and we can just change the color, for instance, to color error base. I'm using some custom attributes here. So, right, let's say I'm going to enter this bit. We can see that we're in an invalid state. We changed the color of the text to red. But if I input a correct email address, the label here gets the default color back. But as soon as I go invalid, yeah, so it changes based on the state of this input. And the same goes for password, right? So if I enter a password of 2 characters, it's invalid. But if I make it 4 characters, it becomes valid. Now, let's add the other changes that should be visible when I have an invalid field. For example, the background color of the input, right? So I can target this, and I can say the input. So when the field is invalid, I can target the input, and I can say background color. And here I'm going to use color error tint 90. All right, so it's starting to look pretty good, but I'm getting an error here, or I'm getting the error styles even though I haven't entered anything. So let's fix that. We can say field has, and here's something else you can do, placeholder shown. So when it's showing its placeholder, meaning I don't have any value entered yet, and let's actually target the input there. I'm going to change this background color to gray 1095. Okay. And also, I'm going to change its color back to the default. Okay. So basically, when I'm showing the placeholder, don't give me the error style. But if the input is in an invalid state, then do show it. Otherwise, go back to default. Also, if this has an error and I focus it, I want to remove that error style. So that's quite easy to do. We can say something like this. When the input is in focus, we change the background color, and we'll do the same thing here. So field has has focus. All right, so now the error state will only be visible when there's an error and the field is not focused, or we don't have a placeholder shown. Cool. Now let's actually show the error field, right? And we need to do 2 things for that. First of all, we need to select the field error in a field that's invalid and doesn't have focus, and set the opacity to 1. So we're going to say field has invalid, but also it's not in focus, right? So I'll say field error and set the opacity to 1. And then the second thing we need to do is hide this when the field has focus. So we can say field has focus, and we'll target field error, and we're going to set the opacity to 0. But also, in addition to this, I want to also hide this when we have a placeholder and it's not in focus. So it's a bit weird, but we have to do this. So we can say placeholder shown, and let's actually select the pseudo-class there. So placeholder shown and not in focus. Okay, so let's see what we have here. Field It's actually field error here. Okay, so invalid, tab away, and now we can see the error field. If I enter a valid email, that goes away. As soon as I use an invalid value, that's shown again. And the same goes for the password. Right? So it's working properly. Now, let's see again exactly what we're doing here. So we have the markup for a specific field where we have the label and we have the input and the field error. The email looks something like this. The password looks something like this. They each have a pattern and they're each required. So if the pattern is not met, they get an invalid state. So what do we do first is we say, okay, if the field has an invalid state, then we change its color. And that's going to affect the, of course, the color of the label. And we change the background color of the input. We make it this very light red. But this should only be visible when we're not focused or when we're not showing the placeholder, right? So when we're not having a value. And then the actual field error, we're showing it when the field is, of course, invalid, but not in focus, right? So you can see as soon as I change focus, we're changing the opacity for that error field. And we're also hiding this error field or this error text when the field has focus and also when we have the placeholder and it's not in focus. It's not that difficult. And this gives you an idea of another use case for the has pseudo element, right? You're not just limited to selecting other elements inside a parent. As you can see here, we use the invalid pseudo class for the parent element. And of course, the invalid pseudo class is applied to an input, right? It's applied here, not on the div itself, but the div with the class of field can have the pseudo class of invalid applied to any of its child elements, which is why this selector is super, super powerful. So that's another use case for the has pseudo elements. Let's move on to the third and final example. And here we have another form. This time it's a kind of form that you get after maybe unsubscribing from a certain service. And it basically say, okay, well, what's your reason for canceling? And you have a couple of different options here. Maybe it's too expensive, maybe I found a better alternative, or maybe it's another reason. And then we have a field here where we can say our reason, like I don't like it anymore. But the thing is, I only want to display this field when other reasons is selected. If this one is selected, then this field doesn't have any relevance, right? So what we can do is in CSS, I have this input field. It's called, or it has an ID of other reason. And I can target that other reason. Let's actually target its parent. So other reason field. And I can say display none. Right, so now that field is hidden regardless of what I have selected here. But then I can say, okay, form has, and we can actually check for a certain option. The one that we're interested in is this one, option value other. So I can say option value equals other. And this one needs to be checked. And then I can target the other reason field, and I can set a display to block or whatever. So now you'll see that when I select either the first or the second one, nothing happens. But if I select the third, then all of a sudden this third field, or this other field is now visible, and I can enter my reason. But this is not visible for any of the other two. And that's thanks to the has selector, right? We're saying, hey, if the form has this option called, or the option that has a value of other, and if that is checked, then I'm going to select the other reason field and I'm going to show it. Otherwise, that particular field is hidden. And there you go. That's the result. Another great use case for the has selector. And that's about it for this course. Let us know if you enjoyed it. And if you have any questions, please leave a comment down below. As always, don't forget to subscribe to the Envato Tuts Plus YouTube channel for more content like this, but also to learn about web development, web design, and much more. It's all free, so make sure to also give this video a thumbs up if you liked it. With that said, thank you very much for watching. I'm Adi, and until next time, take care.